12 steps. Keep that number in mind, because much later, 12 steps will become one of the hardest pieces of evidence in this entire file to explain. Not 12 miles. Not 1,200 steps. 12. And the strange part is that police were building a murder case against a man who, according to their own theory, would have needed to leave his house, cross a road, fight with someone, move a body, get to a vehicle, drive several miles, stop at more than one location, dispose of evidence, and make it home again. But a device on his wrist was quietly recording something very different. We're getting ahead of ourselves, though, because police didn't know any of that when they first saw the body. A little after 1 in the afternoon on May 21, 2016, a farmer in his 60s was working on his land in Wisconsin with his grandson. The grandson wandered a little farther into the field, stopped, and called his grandfather over. From a distance, the shape in front of them didn't immediately look human. Up close, there was no doubt. A woman was lying face down in the field. She appeared to have been there for some time. Police arrived and found a blonde woman who looked to be in her early 30s. She had no clothing on except for socks. Around one wrist was a pink paper band, the kind you might be given when entering a bar, a concert, or some other event. There was also a mark across her back. Her face had been badly injured. There was a deep mark around her neck suggesting that some kind of cord or wire may have been used. Her hands and forearms showed injuries, and her fingernails were damaged. This didn't look like a woman who had simply been left in a field. It looked like there had been a struggle. Officers searched the surrounding area and found tire tracks running from a nearby road toward the place where the body had been left. Those tracks didn't match the farmer's equipment or vehicles. Someone appeared to have driven into the area, looped around, and left again. That immediately changed how police saw the scene. The field probably wasn't where she had been killed. It looked more like a dumping site. And that created the first major problem. Who was she? There was no identification beside the body. No purse. No phone. Nothing obvious that told investigators whose life they were now trying to reconstruct. Her facial injuries also made visual identification difficult. For a few hours, police had a dead woman, a rural field, tire tracks, a pink wristband, and almost nothing else. Then, around 4:30 that afternoon, roughly 3 hours after the body had been found, another call came in. A man wanted to report his girlfriend missing. His name was Doug. He said his girlfriend, Nicole, had disappeared the night before. She was 31 years old. Blonde. They had a 6-month-old son together. They had gone out the previous evening to see a band with friends, and somewhere during that night, he had lost contact with her. Police compared the information. The unidentified woman in the field matched Nicole. Soon, the identification was confirmed. But police made a decision that Doug didn't know about yet. They did not immediately tell him that Nicole was dead. Instead, they treated his call like a missing person report and started asking him questions. Because think about the situation from their side for a moment. Nicole had been killed. Doug was the person closest to her. And he had waited until late afternoon to report her missing. That doesn't prove anything. But it does mean investigators are going to look very closely at what happened inside that relationship, what happened during the missing hours, and whether Doug's version of the night can survive contact with the evidence. So police went to his house. Doug stood in his kitchen and started walking them through the previous evening. And for the first few minutes, nothing he said sounded impossible. Nicole and Doug had gone out with friends to see a rock band. They had arranged for a babysitter to watch their 6-month-old son. Around 8 in the evening, they reached the bar where the band was playing. Everyone entering received one of those pink paper wristbands. The same kind investigators had already seen around Nicole's wrist in the field. Nicole was enjoying herself. According to Doug, she was drinking faster than he was. By the time he was still working through his first drink, Nicole had already had more. The performance ended around 11. The crowd was leaving. Doug said he went to the restroom. When he came out, Nicole was gone. He happened to run into old high school friends he hadn't seen for years and stayed to have a drink with them. Meanwhile, Nicole had gone with other friends to another bar downtown called Sardine. Doug spoke with her and said he would join her. But Nicole began sending messages. "Where are you? Why aren't you here?" Then the tone changed. She started accusing him of talking to another woman. Doug said he thought she was drunk, angry, and overreacting. Around 11:40, Nicole's mood reportedly collapsed. Friends said she left the bar. Someone followed her outside and tried to calm her down, but Nicole pushed that person away and demanded to be left alone. And then she walked away. By herself. Into the night. Doug eventually arrived at the second bar, but Nicole was already gone. Here's where his story starts to feel uncomfortable. He didn't go searching for her. He stayed with friends. He kept drinking. He left around 2:15 in the morning and arrived home at roughly 2:40. Nicole wasn't there. He asked the babysitter whether she had heard anything from Nicole. She hadn't. Doug went to bed. Around 6:30, their baby cried and woke him. Doug got up, checked on the child, then went back to sleep. He woke again around 11. Nicole still hadn't returned. He started making calls. No one seemed to know where she was. Finally, around 4:30 in the afternoon, he called police. Almost 17 hours had passed since Nicole had last been seen by friends. Listen, none of that makes Doug a murderer. People react strangely. People misjudge situations. Couples fight. Someone who has been drinking may assume their partner went somewhere else, stayed with a friend, or simply didn't want to come home. But investigators weren't looking at one strange decision. They were looking at several. And then they asked to see the messages Nicole had sent Doug that night. Most looked like an intoxicated argument between two people whose relationship was already under strain. But one message didn't sit quite as comfortably as the others. Nicole called Doug abusive. She accused him of hurting her. Police asked him why she would say something like that. Doug brushed it off as the kind of thing she said when she drank. That answer didn't resolve anything. It just put another question into the file. Police asked Doug to come with them for a formal interview. He agreed. Once he was inside the interview room, they told him the truth. The woman in the field was Nicole. Doug appeared stunned. Then he broke down. He cried heavily. And maybe those tears were completely genuine. Maybe they weren't. Police couldn't treat emotion as evidence either way. What mattered was everything around it. The 17-hour delay. The messages. The fact that Nicole had walked away drunk and upset while Doug continued drinking. And now police knew something else. Someone had killed Nicole. Someone had moved her body. And somewhere between that bar and the field, there was an actual crime scene they had not found yet. They wouldn't have to search for it very long. Because the following day, something appeared only about 36 meters from Nicole's front door. And once police saw it, Doug went from someone they were watching to the person they thought they were about to arrest. A patrol officer found the first piece away from the house. Near a highway ramp, roughly 3 kilometers from where Nicole's body had been discovered, there was a pile of discarded clothing. The clothes were stained with blood. Nearby were a wallet, a phone, and a work identification card carrying Nicole's name. So now investigators could begin connecting locations. The field held Nicole's body. The highway ramp held her clothing and personal belongings. Whoever had done this had apparently moved through more than one place during the night. Then a neighbor living directly across from Doug and Nicole's home contacted police. He had been cutting grass when his mower ran over something. A black electrical cord. That by itself might not have meant anything. But he had also noticed a dark red area on the ground. Initially, he thought it could have come from an animal. In a rural area, seeing blood beside a road wasn't automatically alarming. Then he learned that Nicole was dead. Suddenly, the blood across from her home didn't look ordinary anymore. Police sealed off the area. They found blood. They found clumps of blonde hair. They found the black cord. And the location was only about 36 meters from the front door of the home Nicole shared with Doug. Testing quickly confirmed that the blood belonged to Nicole. Nicole's DNA was also found on the cord. Think about how this looked from the perspective of an investigator standing there. Doug says he came home around 2:40 in the morning. He says Nicole wasn't there. He goes to sleep. But across the road, just 36 meters away, there appears to be a violent scene involving his missing girlfriend. Blood. Hair. A cord carrying her DNA. If that really was the place where Nicole was attacked, then the crime had happened practically in front of Doug's home. And Doug claimed to know nothing about it. Police obtained a warrant and searched the house. Inside the garage, things seemed to become even worse for him. Investigators saw what appeared to be blood on the floor. There were marks that looked like something may have been dragged. They found a pair of athletic shoes. Remember the mark on Nicole's back? Investigators compared the tread pattern on those shoes with the impression they had seen on her body. They looked very similar. Then they looked at the bottom of the shoes. There was a small red spot. It looked like blood. Now put those pieces together the way police were putting them together at the time. Nicole is killed across the road from the house. There is blood in the garage. There appears to be evidence of dragging. A shoe inside the garage has a tread pattern resembling the mark found on Nicole. And the bottom of that shoe appears to have blood on it. Then investigators went through the bathroom. Inside the trash, they found tissues that appeared to have been used to wipe up blood. One suspicious thing after another. And there was still that message from Nicole calling Doug abusive. Police also began looking deeper into the relationship. This is where some background becomes important, because without it, you don't really understand why investigators became so certain. Nicole was 31, a science teacher, and the mother of 3 children. Her 2 older children were from a previous marriage. Her youngest, a boy only 6 months old, was Doug's son. Nicole and Doug had met in a bar in early 2015. The relationship moved quickly. Nicole became pregnant not long after they met. She and her older children moved into Doug's house. Their son was born near the end of 2015. There had been talk of marriage, although they planned to wait until the baby was a little older. From the outside, you could look at this and see a family being formed. But investigators were now reading private messages that showed something much more troubled. Doug had recently sent his mother a message saying he was considering having Nicole and the children move out. Nicole's messages to Doug were even more concerning. She wrote about being yelled at. She wrote that she had stopped saying things because of the way he reacted. She accused him of making her feel worthless. She complained that he had shouted at their infant son and told them to move out. Nicole's mother and sister told police that Nicole had said Doug had hit her. She had never formally reported that allegation. Police also looked at Doug's previous relationships. One former girlfriend had made a report accusing him of hitting her, although that matter did not result in a prosecution. Another former girlfriend said Doug had secretly installed tracking software on her phone. Again, none of that proves murder. And this is important. A history of controlling or aggressive behavior can be relevant to investigators, but it does not automatically answer what happened on a specific night. The problem was that police weren't looking at those allegations by themselves. They were placing them beside the blood, the hair, the cord, the garage, the shoes, the messages. And then one statement appeared that was much harder to understand. According to the babysitter, Doug made a comment after Nicole's body had been identified. He said something along the lines of, "I don't know. She hit her head and tried to walk home." Read that again. She hit her head. At that point, according to the file, details of Nicole's cause of death had not been publicly released. The autopsy would later conclude that one of the causes of her death involved blunt force trauma to the head. So how did Doug know there had been a head injury? Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe the babysitter misunderstood what he meant. Maybe Doug had heard something indirectly. But there was no obvious explanation sitting in front of investigators. And if you are already suspicious of him, that sentence sounds terrible. Police began forming a theory. Perhaps Doug and Nicole's relationship had deteriorated under the pressure of suddenly becoming a household with 3 children. Perhaps resentment had grown. Perhaps the argument from the bar continued once Nicole came near the house. Perhaps there was a confrontation across the road. Again, this was a theory, not a fact. But investigators believed the evidence was lining up. By the 3rd day, Doug was arrested for first-degree murder. And publicly, the reaction was predictable. The boyfriend had been arrested. There were claims of an abusive relationship. There was blood near the house. There was what looked like blood in his garage. There was a shoe that appeared to match an impression on Nicole's body. There were bloodied tissues in his bathroom. For people watching from the outside, the case looked almost finished. Police were waiting on laboratory results. They expected those results to complete the picture. Instead, the laboratory was about to start dismantling it. One piece at a time. Let's start with the shoes. That little red spot on the sole looked like blood. Investigators believed it could be Nicole's. The lab said otherwise. It wasn't human blood. It was turkey blood. Doug had butchered a turkey in the garage several weeks earlier. That explained the red material on the shoe. Fine. One piece gone. But there was still blood on the garage floor. Except the testing came back on that too. Turkey. Not Nicole. Now the garage was starting to look very different from what police had imagined. What about the tissues in the bathroom trash? Those definitely contained human blood. But the DNA did not belong to Nicole. It belonged to Nicole's sister. According to the file, Nicole's sister had rushed to Doug's home after hearing that Nicole was missing and that an unidentified body had been found nearby. When she learned that the dead woman was Nicole, she became overwhelmed and suffered a nosebleed. She went into the bathroom, used tissues, and threw them away. So the apparently sinister attempt to clean up blood? A grieving sister's nosebleed. The suspicious blood in the garage? A turkey. The red spot on the shoe? Also a turkey. Remember how strong the case looked only a short time earlier? This is why physical evidence needs testing. A red stain is not the same thing as blood from a victim. A shoe pattern that looks similar is not the same thing as proving that shoe made an impression. An object being in a suspicious place is not enough by itself. Police had moved quickly because the total picture looked overwhelming. The total picture was now coming apart. And then the DNA results arrived. Forensic examiners had collected male DNA from 16 different places on Nicole's body. They compared that profile with Doug. It did not match him. That did not automatically prove Doug could not have been involved. But it introduced something police urgently needed to explain. Who did that DNA belong to? Because it belonged to the same unidentified male. Now we need to go back to Doug's wrist. During the first visit to his home, an investigator had noticed that Doug was wearing an activity tracker. Nicole had given it to him as a gift. That tiny detail could easily have meant nothing. But investigators pulled the device data. They focused on the hours between roughly 2:45 in the morning and 6:30. That window mattered because police believed Nicole had been killed and moved during those hours. The tracker showed 12 steps. That's it. 12. A person could take 12 steps getting out of bed, walking a short distance, checking on a crying baby, using a bathroom, then lying down again. What 12 steps do not easily explain is the theory police had built. Leave the house. Cross the road. Fight with Nicole. Move her body. Get to a vehicle. Drive to the field. Unload the body. Drive to the highway ramp. Dispose of her clothing and belongings. Return home. And somehow do all of that while the tracker records 12 steps. Maybe Doug had removed the device. That would be the obvious counterargument. But the tracker was recording movement during the night. According to the reasoning in the file, if the device had been removed entirely, those 12 steps would not have been recorded as movement on his wrist. The simplest reading was that Doug had been wearing it and barely moved. Now stop here. This is one of those moments where the entire mood of an investigation changes. Police hadn't just found a weak spot in their theory. They had found evidence that directly conflicted with the physical activity their theory required. And remember, other evidence had already collapsed. The garage blood wasn't Nicole's. The shoe stain wasn't Nicole's. The tissues weren't Nicole's. The male DNA on Nicole wasn't Doug's. The tracker suggested he hardly moved. The case against him no longer looked like a nearly finished murder prosecution. It looked like police had arrested the wrong man. On June 10, after 18 days in custody, Doug was released because the evidence was insufficient to hold him for Nicole's murder. 18 days. That number mattered for a different reason. If Doug wasn't the killer, then the actual killer had just been given more than 2 weeks while police focused on someone else. 2 weeks to destroy evidence. 2 weeks to leave Wisconsin. 2 weeks to disappear. And now investigators had to admit something they probably hated admitting. They were almost back where they had started. Almost. Because they still had that unidentified male DNA from Nicole's body. The problem was that the profile wasn't complete enough for a useful national database comparison. So investigators returned to the witnesses. They reviewed statements. They looked again at surveillance recordings from businesses in the area. They searched for any image that might show where Nicole went after she walked away. Nothing gave them the answer they needed. The laboratory work continued slowly. Wisconsin's crime lab had a backlog, and investigators could only submit limited batches of evidence at a time. According to the file, they were allowed to send 10 samples in each batch. So they had to choose carefully. What item had the best chance of carrying DNA from the person who had been with Nicole during her final hours? They sent one group. Waited. Reviewed the results. Selected another group. Waited again. Nearly 3 months passed. Then, in August, investigators submitted another batch. Inside that batch was something most people probably wouldn't have considered the most important object in this case. Nicole's socks. Remember how she was found? Her other clothing was gone. But the socks remained on her feet. The laboratory tested them. And this time, they recovered a complete male DNA profile. Investigators entered it into the database. A name came back. George Birch. And almost everyone looking at the file had the same immediate reaction. Who is George Birch? Because Nicole's family didn't know him. Her friends didn't know him. Her co-workers didn't seem to know him. Doug's circle didn't provide an obvious connection either. The name did not fit anywhere. And when police looked up where he came from, the situation became even stranger. Birch was from Virginia. Nearly 2,000 kilometers from Wisconsin. So now the case had shifted from the boyfriend who lived 36 meters from the apparent attack site to a man from the East Coast whom nobody around Nicole appeared to recognize. The DNA had given police a name. But a name was not enough. They still needed to explain how George Birch entered Nicole's life. And more importantly, how he entered the final hours of it. That answer was already sitting inside a police computer. Investigators just didn't know it yet. George Birch was 38 when Nicole was killed. His history immediately caught the attention of investigators. When he was around 20, he had been accused in the shooting death of a gang leader. He faced several charges, including first-degree murder, but a jury acquitted him because the evidence was not sufficient to convict. He also had records involving burglary and illegal possession of firearms. Again, criminal history does not prove someone committed a later crime. Police knew that. The DNA mattered far more. And there was another fact they could verify. Birch had moved to Wisconsin on March 1, 2016. Roughly 2.5 months before Nicole died. So the distance from Virginia was no longer the mystery it first appeared to be. He was living in Wisconsin when Nicole was killed. Still, police faced a serious problem. DNA can prove contact. It can place two people in some form of physical proximity. But depending on where it is found and the circumstances around it, DNA by itself does not always tell you whether the contact was criminal. What investigators needed was independent evidence connecting Birch to Nicole's movements that night. And this is where the file takes one of its strangest turns. Because the evidence came from a completely unrelated hit-and-run case. Birch drove a red Chevrolet. Less than 3 weeks after Nicole's death, on June 8, that vehicle was involved in a hit-and-run collision. The car was badly damaged. Then someone set it on fire. Eventually, the burned vehicle was sent to a scrapyard and crushed. By the time investigators on Nicole's case identified Birch through DNA, the car itself was essentially gone. That sounds like a dead end. But the traffic case had created something more valuable than the vehicle. Data. When officers questioned Birch about the hit and run, they weren't thinking about Nicole. They were investigating a traffic offense. Birch wanted to prove that he had nothing to do with the crash. So, according to the file, he offered his phone records. "You can check my phone." He signed written consent allowing police to examine the device. Officers copied the phone's data. Then the copy went into the police system with the rest of that hit-and-run investigation. And there it sat. No one handling the traffic matter apparently had any reason to connect the phone to a murder. Months later, Nicole's investigators finally had the name George Birch from the DNA database. They searched that name inside law enforcement records. The hit-and-run file appeared. Inside it was the copied phone data. Birch had used an Android phone connected to a Google account. Location history was enabled, which meant the phone had been quietly storing where it traveled. Now imagine being the investigator opening that location history for the first time. You already know where Nicole's blood was found. You know where her body was found. You know where her clothing was found. You know roughly when these events must have happened. And now you can watch a phone move through the night. Birch had been drinking earlier at a bar called Lugu. It wasn't the sardine bar where Nicole had last been with friends. But the two locations were only a few hundred meters apart. Around 2:30 in the morning, Birch left the bar and returned to his residence. He stayed there for only about 6 minutes. Then the phone moved again. Around 3:01 a.m., Birch's phone appeared on the street near Nicole's home. The same area where the neighbor would later find Nicole's blood, blonde hair, and the black cord. The phone remained there for approximately 52 minutes. That is a long time. Around 3:53, the phone began moving. About 5 minutes later, it reached the farmland where Nicole's body would be discovered. It remained near that location for roughly 4 minutes. Then the phone moved again. Around 4:05, it appeared near the highway ramp. The same place where Nicole's blood-stained clothing, wallet, phone, and work identification had been found. Around 4:22, the phone was back at Birch's residence. Stop. Forget every other piece of evidence for a moment. Just look at that route. Nicole's apparent attack site. Then the field where her body was dumped. Then the highway ramp where her clothing and belongings were discarded. Then back home. And the order is exactly the order that makes sense if one person moved through all three scenes during the hours Nicole disappeared. This is no longer just DNA saying Birch had contact with Nicole. This is his phone moving through the geography of the crime. Of course, there was still a question. A phone is not a person. Could someone else have had it? Could the data be inaccurate? Could there be another explanation for why Birch was in those places? Investigators kept going. They looked at his Google search history and found something else. In the period following Nicole's death, Birch had searched for information about her case 64 times. Not once. Not twice. 64. The searches reportedly focused on developments such as whether Nicole's boyfriend had been arrested, whether there were new suspects, and whether DNA results had come back. Could an innocent person follow a local murder investigation closely? Absolutely. People become obsessed with news stories all the time. But combine 64 searches with the DNA and the location route, and the context changes. Now investigators believed they had the person they had been looking for. On September 7, George Birch was arrested for first-degree murder. He did not provide investigators with a detailed account. He asked for a lawyer. For a while, the evidence seemed almost impossible to overcome. DNA. Location history. Search history. 3 separate categories, all pointing in the same direction. But a trial does not ask whether evidence looks bad. It asks whether the prosecution can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And when Birch finally took the witness stand, he offered an explanation that tried to account for almost every piece of evidence against him. The strange thing? Parts of it fit. At least at first. Birch did not deny being with Nicole. That would have been difficult with the DNA. Instead, he told the jury that their contact had been voluntary. According to him, he was drinking alone at the Lugu bar when a blonde woman approached and sat beside him. They talked. They got along. By his account, they remained together until the bar closed. Then Birch offered to take Nicole home. She agreed. This version immediately explained one major problem for the defense. Why was Birch's DNA on Nicole? Because, he said, they had consensual sexual contact. According to his testimony, they stopped near Nicole's home and began an intimate encounter involving his vehicle. Birch was nearly 2 meters tall. He claimed that because of his size, he could not comfortably fit into the back seat, so Nicole was partly inside the vehicle while he remained outside. Then his story changed completely. Birch said someone struck him from behind. He claimed he was hit in the back of the head and lost consciousness. When he woke up, he was on the ground. A man was standing over him with a handgun. Nicole was nearby. She was badly injured and no longer moving. Birch said he did not know the man at the time. He later learned, according to his testimony, that it was Doug. Now we need to be careful here. This was Birch's courtroom account. It was not a fact established independently by the file. But if you are a defense attorney, you can immediately see why the story matters. Because it tries to absorb all the prosecution's strongest evidence rather than deny it. Why was Birch near Nicole's house? Because Nicole took him there voluntarily. Why was his DNA on her? Because they had consensual contact. Why did his phone travel from Nicole's street to the field where her body was found? Because Doug allegedly held him at gunpoint and forced him to move the body. Why did Birch's phone go near the highway ramp? Because Nicole's belongings were still in the vehicle, and he later threw them out. Why did he search for Nicole's case dozens of times? Because, he said, he had been dragged into a murder and was terrified police would eventually connect him to it. If all you do is line up evidence with explanations, the defense has now given the jury an alternate story. Birch continued. He said Doug forced him to place Nicole's body into the vehicle and drive to a location where the body was dumped. At some point, according to Birch, he saw an opportunity. He pushed Doug. He ran back to the vehicle. He drove away. On the way home, he realized Nicole's clothing was still inside, so he threw it from the window near the highway ramp. He did not call police. The next day, he went fishing with a friend. That last part created an obvious problem. If you had just been attacked, knocked unconscious, held at gunpoint, forced to help move a dead woman, then escaped from the alleged killer, why would you say nothing? Birch said he was afraid. He feared retaliation. Possible? Yes. But the prosecution had several more questions. Birch claimed Doug struck the back of his head hard enough to knock him unconscious. Birch wore his hair extremely short. The prosecution wanted to know why his friend, who saw him the next day, did not notice a significant head injury. Birch's explanation was that he was very tall, making the top or back of his head difficult for other people to see. Then there was the gun. Birch said Doug had threatened him with a handgun. Police had looked into Doug's registered firearms. According to the file, Doug owned long guns, including hunting weapons and rifles. But investigators did not find a handgun registered to him. That does not prove he could never have possessed one. But it left Birch unable to point to the weapon he described. And then the prosecution returned to those 12 steps. Remember them? Birch's story required Doug to be outside the house, active for a significant period, involved in a violent confrontation, helping move Nicole, traveling to the field, and participating in the events Birch described. Doug's tracker showed 12 steps between roughly 2:45 and 6:30 in the morning. 12. For the prosecution, that wasn't a small inconsistency. It cut directly into the physical possibility of Birch's story. But there was another piece of evidence that may have been even more difficult for him to explain. Nicole's pants. They had been recovered near the highway ramp with the rest of the discarded items. They were covered with blood and dirt. Hair was stuck to them. Why did that matter? Because Birch's account required Nicole to have voluntarily removed clothing before the alleged attack by Doug. If that were true, prosecutors argued, the pants should not have been covered in the kind of blood and dirt you would expect if Nicole had been wearing them during a violent struggle on the ground. The prosecution's theory was different. Nicole was attacked while still dressed. Her clothes became bloody and dirty during that assault. They were removed only after she was dead. Why remove them? The prosecution believed the killer may have been trying to make immediate identification more difficult. Now Birch's explanation had a serious problem. His DNA could be explained. His location could be explained. Even the discarded clothes could be explained. But the condition of those clothes did not fit comfortably with the sequence he described. Still, the defense had one weapon left. Doug. Because no matter how many pieces of evidence had collapsed during the investigation, there were still things about Doug that nobody could make disappear completely. And the defense was about to put those things in front of the jury. The defense called Doug to the stand. They returned to his relationship with Nicole. The conflict. The messages. His statement to his mother about considering having Nicole and the children move out. The allegations from previous relationships. The fact that the apparent attack site was directly across from his home. But there was one question they clearly wanted the jury to remember. The head injury. The babysitter had told investigators that Doug said Nicole had hit her head before the official cause of death had been released publicly. So the defense asked him about it. Doug denied saying it. Completely. According to him, that statement had never come out of his mouth. Then the babysitter testified. She said it had. Now we have a direct conflict. One person says the sentence was spoken. The other says it was not. And this is exactly the kind of unresolved detail a defense attorney wants. They do not necessarily have to prove Doug killed Nicole. They only have to create reasonable doubt about whether Birch did. If jurors begin thinking, what if police had the right suspect the first time, then the defense has achieved something important. So they rebuilt the old case against Doug. He had a possible relationship motive. He had told his mother he was considering ending the living arrangement. Nicole had accused him of mistreatment. There were allegations that she had told relatives Doug had hit her. The apparent attack location was almost on his doorstep. And then, before the head injury was public, the babysitter said Doug referenced Nicole hitting her head. If you ignore the tracker, that sounds deeply suspicious. But you cannot ignore the tracker. That was the problem. You also cannot ignore the DNA. Or the location history. Or Birch's phone moving to the field. Or Birch's phone moving to the highway ramp. This trial became less about finding one perfect piece of evidence and more about asking which complete story could survive all the pieces at once. The defense pushed another issue. The black electrical cord found near Nicole's blood. Remember, Nicole's DNA was on it, and investigators believed a cord or wire had been used around her neck. The defense suggested that the cord might have come from Doug's home. If they could physically connect the suspected weapon to his property, Birch's story would gain something it badly needed. Not just suspicion. A bridge. So during jury deliberations, the jurors made a request. They wanted to see the black cord recovered near the blood. And they wanted to compare it with cords found inside Doug's home. You can imagine the tension around that request. Because if those wires looked like they came from the same set, the prosecution could suddenly have a major new reasonable doubt problem. The jurors examined them. They did not match. The connection the defense had implied wasn't there. The jury returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. George Birch was convicted. During sentencing, the judge said the crime was serious enough that, in a jurisdiction with capital punishment, it could have justified the death penalty. Wisconsin does not have the death penalty. Birch received life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a lot of cases, that would be the end. Evidence is presented. A jury decides. A sentence is imposed. File closed. But there was still one piece of this case that had not finished causing trouble. The phone. Not what was on it. How police got to use it. And that question would eventually reach the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Think back to how investigators obtained Birch's phone data. Not through Nicole's murder investigation. Not through a murder search warrant. It came from the hit and run. Birch had been trying to prove that he wasn't responsible for that traffic offense. He voluntarily signed a consent form. Police copied the contents of his phone. Months later, homicide investigators found that copy in the law enforcement system and used it in Nicole's case. The defense challenged that. Their argument was precise. Birch had consented to police using his phone in relation to a traffic investigation. He had not, according to the defense, given unlimited permission for those same copied contents to be searched by another department for an unrelated murder. If the homicide search exceeded the scope of his consent, the defense argued, then the use of that data violated his protection from unreasonable searches. And if the phone data was legally tainted, it might have to be excluded. Now think about what disappears if that argument succeeds. The 301 location near Nicole's home. The 52 minutes there. The movement to the field. The 4 minutes near the dumping site. The stop near the highway ramp. The return home. Possibly the search history showing dozens of queries about Nicole's case. That doesn't erase the DNA. But the DNA alone tells a much less complete story. Without the phone, Birch can still say he met Nicole consensually. The prosecution loses the digital route that places his device at every major location. So this wasn't some minor technical appeal. It went directly to the heart of the prosecution's case. The issue traveled through the courts and eventually reached the Wisconsin Supreme Court. On June 29, 2021, more than 5 years after Nicole's death, the court issued its decision. The vote was close. 4-3. 4 justices concluded that the phone evidence could be used. 3 disagreed. The majority reasoned that Birch had voluntarily consented to police copying the full contents of his phone. Once those contents had been lawfully obtained and stored, another law enforcement unit could later access that existing copy during a separate investigation. The conviction remained intact. Life without parole stood. And the legal fight created a broader issue beyond Nicole's case. According to the file, the ruling became associated with an important principle concerning digital evidence. When a person voluntarily allows law enforcement to obtain data from an electronic device, information lawfully acquired in that process may later be available to other investigators working on another case. There is something strange about the symmetry here. Birch offered the phone because he believed it could help him. He wanted it to protect him in one investigation. Instead, the stored data became some of the strongest evidence used against him in another. And there is another symmetry that is even harder to ignore. Doug's wearable device quietly recorded his lack of movement. Birch's phone quietly recorded his movement. One digital record helped destroy the case against the first suspect. Another helped build the case against the man eventually convicted. 2 devices. 2 men. 2 completely different stories. But before we close the file, Doug's role needs one more look. Not because the evidence in this case established that he killed Nicole. It did not. But because being cleared of Nicole's murder did not make every troubling thing around him disappear. Doug spent 18 days in custody for a murder he was not ultimately prosecuted for. His girlfriend was dead. Police had publicly focused on him. People in the community had already formed opinions. You might expect that once the murder charge collapsed, he would become one of the most sympathetic figures around the case. That wasn't quite what happened. Nicole's sister continued visiting Doug's home because she wanted to help care for Nicole's 6-month-old son. The child was her sister's baby. She wanted to stay involved. One day, according to the file, Doug and Nicole's sister drove together to a friend's birthday gathering. During the drive, Doug touched her knee in a way she interpreted as suggestive. She told him not to do that. His reaction, according to the allegations, was extreme. Doug became angry. He locked the doors. He accelerated. She asked him to stop so she could get out. He did not. She became frightened. Her requests turned into crying and screaming. The vehicle reportedly went through a red light. Eventually, she began kicking the windshield. Only then did Doug stop the car. Nicole's sister later brought the matter into court. Doug faced accusations including reckless endangerment, false imprisonment, and disorderly conduct. According to the file, he ultimately pleaded guilty to a lesser offense involving negligent driving, with the understanding that the more serious charges could be dismissed if he avoided further trouble during a set period. Why include this? Because the easiest version of Nicole's case would divide everyone into simple categories. The innocent boyfriend. The guilty stranger. The victim. Done. But real files rarely stay that clean. Doug could be wrongly accused of Nicole's murder and still have serious problems in his behavior. Those things can exist together. His past allegations did not prove he killed Nicole. His later conduct did not retroactively make him Nicole's killer. And the fact that police arrested the wrong man first does not mean they were foolish for examining him. Look at what they had before the lab results. A strained relationship. Messages suggesting possible abuse. A statement about Nicole's head injury that the babysitter later insisted Doug had made. Blood across the road. Accord with Nicole's DNA. A suspected crime scene 36 meters from his home. Apparent blood in his garage. A shoe pattern that looked similar to an impression on Nicole. A red stain on the sole. Bloodied tissues inside the house. From a distance, it looked overwhelming. The mistake was treating the appearance of those clues as if their meaning had already been proven. Because once the lab started answering the questions, the narrative changed. Turkey blood. A sister's nosebleed. Unknown male DNA. 12 steps. And suddenly, the case that looked finished was no longer a case at all. That's the part of this file that bothers me most. Not because police suspected Doug. They had reasons to suspect him. What bothers me is how easily independent pieces of innocent evidence can start reinforcing one another when you already believe you know what happened. A red stain looks like the victim's blood because you expect it to be. A shoe looks like the right shoe because you were already looking for a match. Tissues look like cleanup because cleanup fits your theory. A troubled relationship starts to feel like a complete motive. One piece gives meaning to the next. Then the next piece appears to confirm the one before it. And very quickly, a theory begins to feel like a fact. Until a laboratory result says no. That wasn't her blood. And then another says no. That wasn't her blood either. And then DNA says the male profile isn't him. And then a tracker says he barely moved. That is why this case isn't really about one dramatic clue. It is about what happens when clues are tested instead of merely interpreted. And it is also about how one tiny object that seems almost irrelevant can outlast a much bigger theory. Nicole's socks did exactly that. Think about every object police recovered. The black cord. The clothing. The phone. The wallet. The work identification. The shoes in Doug's garage. The tissues. The activity tracker. The red Chevrolet. And yet the item that gave investigators a complete DNA profile was a pair of socks still on Nicole's feet when she was found. That is almost painfully ordinary. The killer, whoever investigators were looking for at the time, had apparently removed Nicole's other clothing. Her belongings were separated from her body and dumped near the highway. The body was left in a field. But the socks stayed. Months later, technicians tested them. And that quiet piece of fabric introduced George Birch into the file. Without it, investigators still had unidentified male DNA from Nicole. But they did not have a usable database match. Without the match, they had no reason to search law enforcement systems for Birch. Without that search, they might not have opened the hit-and-run file. Without the hit-and-run file, they might not have found the copy of his phone. Without the phone, they would not have seen the route. Nicole's street. The field. The highway ramp. Home. One small forensic success unlocked another investigation that unlocked a phone that unlocked a map. That is how this case actually moved. Not in one giant reveal. Piece by piece. And if we're being careful, there are still questions the evidence does not answer perfectly. We know Birch gave a version of events involving consensual contact with Nicole and coercion by Doug. The jury rejected that version. We know the prosecution argued that the condition of Nicole's clothing contradicted his account. We know Doug's tracker made Birch's claim about Doug's involvement extremely difficult to reconcile with the recorded activity. We know the wires from Doug's home did not match the suspected weapon when jurors asked to compare them. We know Birch's phone traveled through the major locations. We know his DNA was recovered. We know he searched the case repeatedly. But there remains that strange statement attributed to Doug. She hit her head. Doug denied it. The babysitter insisted he said it. The file does not give us a clean answer for why that disagreement existed. And maybe that's okay. A criminal case does not require every strange sentence in the record to be solved before a jury can reach a verdict. What it requires is proof beyond a reasonable doubt regarding the defendant. Still, when you read the file closely, that unresolved line sticks. It reminds you why the defense had something to work with. It reminds you that real investigations are not tidy. And it reminds you why the jury wanted to see those courts for themselves before deciding. They weren't just passively accepting the prosecution's story. They were checking whether the alternate theory had physical support. It didn't. And once that final comparison failed, the overall picture against Birch remained far stronger than the alternative he offered. But the most remarkable clue in the case wasn't the cord. It wasn't even the DNA. For me, it is still the contrast between those two devices. One on a wrist. One in a pocket. Because together they tell almost the whole story of how investigators got the wrong man, let him go, and eventually found the man they would convict. Go back to the night itself. Doug says he gets home around 2:40 in the morning. His girlfriend is missing. He goes to bed. Police eventually build a theory in which he leaves that house and commits a series of physically demanding acts. His tracker says 12 steps. Now look at Birch. His phone returns home around 2:30. It stays there for about 6 minutes. Then it leaves. At 3:01, it is near Nicole's home. 52 minutes. Then it moves. Within minutes, it reaches the field. 4 minutes. Then the highway ramp. Then home by 4:22. If this were fiction, you might say the contrast is too perfect. But this is exactly why digital evidence has become so powerful. People forget what their devices remember. A person can lie. A person can misremember. A witness can become confused. A suspect can create an alternate explanation. But a tracker counting movement and a phone recording location history do not care what later story anyone tells. That doesn't mean digital data is magically infallible. It still has to be collected properly, interpreted correctly, authenticated, put in context. Birch's entire appeal showed how important those legal questions are. But once investigators had the records and the court allowed them, the two devices created a striking contrast. Doug's device showed inactivity during the time police needed him to be active. Birch's device showed movement through the exact places investigators needed to explain. And Birch could not simply say the phone was wrong, because his own courtroom story effectively admitted being at those locations. He had to explain why. That is an important distinction. His defense did not attack the route by saying, "I was never there." It built a new story around the route. Nicole brought him near the home voluntarily. Doug appeared. Doug forced him to move the body. Birch escaped. He discarded the clothing. He returned home. The data stayed the same. Only the meaning changed. So the jury had to choose between two interpretations of the same map. Was Birch moving through those places because he was committing the crime? Or because someone else forced him to participate? That is where the rest of the evidence mattered. Doug's tracker. The missing handgun. The lack of an obvious head injury noticed the next day. The condition of Nicole's pants. The wire comparison. The DNA. The 64 searches. None of those pieces is as powerful alone as they are together. And that may be the central lesson in this file. Evidence does not live in isolation. The same thing that nearly destroyed Doug was a cluster of clues whose meanings were wrong. The same thing that convicted Birch was a cluster of clues whose meanings reinforced one another even after his explanation was heard. The difference was testing. Doug's apparent blood evidence failed testing. Birch's DNA survived it. Doug's activity data contradicted the murder theory. Birch's location data supported the prosecution's timeline. The cord from Doug's home failed to match. The phone route remained. That is a very different kind of case from one solved by a confession. Birch did not sit in an interrogation room and give police the story they wanted. They had to reconstruct it from what he left behind. And the strangest part is that some of the most useful evidence had been handed to law enforcement by Birch himself for a completely different reason. He wanted his phone to save him from a hit-and-run investigation. Years later, the legality of using that same data for murder would split the state's highest court 4-3. That's how close one of the most important pieces of the case came to being thrown into a legal gray area. And maybe that is the right place to return to Nicole. Because with all the discussion about Doug, Birch, DNA, phones, search law, wires, shoes, and trackers, it is easy for the center of the file to become evidence instead of the person those pieces belong to. Nicole was 31. A teacher. A mother of 3. Her youngest child was only 6 months old. She went out one night with friends. She became upset. She walked away alone. And within hours, investigators would eventually reconstruct a path connecting a street near her home, a field, and a highway ramp. That's the human part of the file that no clever forensic detail should erase. There is a temptation, when a case ends in conviction, to read backward and make everything look obvious. George Birch's DNA was there. His phone route was there. His search history was there. So of course police should have known from the start. But that is not what happened. They did not know George Birch existed. They had no name for the male DNA. Nicole had no obvious known relationship with him. His vehicle was gone by the time his name entered the murder investigation. And the phone data was buried in a separate traffic file. Meanwhile, the person standing directly in front of police was Doug. The boyfriend. The man who waited nearly 17 hours to report Nicole missing. The man whose relationship with her appeared troubled. The man whose home sat 36 meters from blood and hair. The man with apparent blood in his garage. The man with suspicious tissues in his bathroom. The man with a shoe that seemed to fit a mark on Nicole. The man whom a babysitter said mentioned a head injury before that information was public. If you only had the first pages of this file, you might suspect Doug too. That is why the twist matters. Not because police were stupid. Because the evidence looked one way before it was tested. The garage stain was real. Police didn't imagine it. They misinterpreted what it meant. The stain on the shoe was real. Wrong source. The tissues really contained blood. Wrong person. The shoe pattern really looked similar. That still did not prove the shoe was part of the crime. This case forces you to separate observation from conclusion. There is blood. That is an observation. It must be Nicole's. That is a conclusion. The shoe pattern looks similar. Observation. This shoe made the mark. Conclusion. The boyfriend has a troubled relationship with the victim. Observation. Therefore he killed her. Conclusion. Those are not the same thing. And once investigators finally separated them, the case opened again. That took them to the socks. The socks took them to DNA. The DNA took them to Birch. Birch's name took them to the hit and run. The hit and run took them to the copied phone. The phone drew the route. The route connected the scenes. And then Birch himself took the stand and tried to redraw the meaning of that route. The jury listened. They also listened to Doug. They listened to the babysitter. They examined the wires. They weighed the competing stories. And they unanimously convicted Birch. Years later, the legal system examined the phone evidence again from a completely different angle. Not, what does this data show? But were police allowed to use it? 4 justices said yes. 3 said no. That narrow split matters because it reminds us that even very strong evidence can exist inside difficult legal questions. Truth in a criminal case is never just about finding information. It is also about whether that information was obtained and used within the rules. In Birch's case, the conviction survived. But there is one final thing I keep coming back to. 12 steps. When police arrested Doug, they had a whole narrative. A relationship under pressure. Possible abuse. A violent confrontation. A body moved in the night. A garage. A shoe. Blood. It was a big theory built out of big, frightening pieces. And what helped break that theory was a tiny number recorded on a device nobody had gone looking for as the centerpiece of the case. 12. Then months later, another ordinary digital record gave investigators the opposite kind of information. Movement. A phone leaving home. A phone arriving near Nicole Street. A phone staying there for 52 minutes. A phone going to a field. A phone going to a highway ramp. A phone returning home. One device said a man barely moved. The other showed a man moving through the entire geography of the crime. That contrast is what makes this file so difficult to forget. Because the truth did not appear as one dramatic confession. It appeared as corrections. No, that blood isn't hers. No, those tissues don't mean what you think they mean. No, the DNA isn't his. No, the tracker doesn't support that timeline. Then, finally. Yes. This DNA has a name. Yes. That name exists in another police file. Yes. There is a phone copy. Yes. The location history is still there. And yes, the route passes through every place that matters. The frightening part isn't that investigators once believed the wrong story. That can happen. The frightening part is how convincing the wrong story looked before the evidence was actually tested. And maybe that is what gray verdict files should leave us with here. Not that every first suspect is innocent. Not that every police theory is wrong. Not that digital evidence is perfect. Something simpler. When a case seems almost too clean, when every clue appears to point in the same direction, that may be exactly when you need to slow down and ask one more question. What do we actually know? Not what does this look like? Not what would make sense? Not what fits the person we already suspect? What can the evidence really prove? Because in Nicole's case, the difference between those two questions was 18 days in jail for one man, months of uncertainty for investigators, a stranger's name hidden inside a pair of socks, and a phone that had already recorded a route nobody yet knew they needed. And all of it came back to details that looked small when they first entered the file. A pink paper wristband. A black cord in the grass. A red spot on a shoe. A pair of socks. A copied phone. 12 steps. Small things. But sometimes a case does not turn on the loudest clue. Sometimes it turns on the one that refuses to fit the story everyone has already decided to believe.